To Beijing now, where U.S. President Joe Biden's national security advisor has met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. The rare in-person meeting with China's leader caps 3 days of high-level talks for Jake Sullivan. It comes at a time of increased tensions between the two countries. Beijing is unhappy about U.S. military support for the self-governing territory of Taiwan, which China claims as its own, and confrontations between Chinese naval vessels and another U.S. ally, the Philippines, over maritime borders in the South China Sea are also becoming more intense. Now, the U.S. has imposed tariffs on Chinese imports and banned the sale of some advanced technology to China. Here's National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan.
I explained why it is that we feel we have to take some targeted restrictions to ensure that advanced technologies aren't used against U.S. national security. I explained that our approach is one of de-risking, not decoupling, and described in some detail how we saw de-risking in practice. And I also raised our concerns about steps that the PRC has taken with respect to the intersection of economics and national security and the impact that that has had on Western businesses and on supply chains. And so we had a vigorous give and take on the issue.
During Jake Sullivan's meeting, Chinese President Xi hailed the traditional friendship between China and the U.S. I asked Dmitri Alperovitch, founder of the think tank Silverado Policy Accelerator and author of World on the Brink, if he thinks this is an accurate description of their relationship.
No, not even close. Look, the reality is that we are in a new Cold War with China, as I argue in my book. China knows that. The United States knows that. Even Jake Sullivan, in his press conference, even though he didn't use the words the Cold War, talked about the need to manage this competition with China. So this was not a friendly meeting by any stretch of the imagination. Even Jake talked about this being a tough conversation.
But it was a meeting, and that is a step forward from where we were last year. So how important is it that these two superpowers keep it civil, at least?
Well, very important, because this is a very dangerous time. We are a world on the brink. And the reality is that during the first Cold War, of course, we had numerous conversations with the Soviets. We had arms control agreements. We had a variety of other fora in which we've discussed issues and tried to get the other side to understand our position. And that is exactly what we're doing here. Jake Sullivan was very clear. This was not about trying to get the Chinese to do something that they do not want to do. They realize that would be futile, nor is it about changing U.S. policy and changing the way that we think we need to pursue our national security interests. But it is about trying to explain the issues that both sides are concerned about to try to avoid misunderstanding and miscalculation.
Now that you mentioned miscalculations, where do you think that Cold War, that new Cold War, as you call it, is most likely to heat up?
Well, in the mid to long terms, I believe that the Taiwan Strait is really that regional flashpoint that can bring China and the United States potentially into a new war, a war that we haven't seen on the scale since really World War II, and we need to do everything in our power to try to avoid it. But in the short term, there is potential for destabilizing actions in the South China Sea, where you have these confrontations on an almost weekly basis now between the Filipino Navy and the Chinese Navy. The Filipino Navy trying to resupply their ship, the Sierra Madre, that has been grounded on one of the shoals in South China Sea since 1999. The Chinese confronting very aggressively, trying to ram ships, using water cannons, injuring Filipino soldiers. And of course, the United States has a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines.
But they're also competitors in many other areas. Where is that strategic rivalry most acutely felt right now?
Well, I think it's mostly acutely felt in the technological space. And in fact, Jake Sullivan coined this phrase, small yard, high fence, to try to explain the policy of the United States to try to curtail China's ambitions in areas like artificial intelligence, semiconductor development, and others. And the Chinese are very unhappy about that. They believe that this is part of the United States strategy to contain China. And frankly, it is, even though the United States will not admit it so.
The U.S. is heading into a presidential election later this year, and at this point, it's anyone's guess how that will play out. Between the two candidates, who do you think would be able to better handle China?
Well, the remarkable thing is that the policies of Donald Trump, which were very aggressive and a huge change from the preceding presidents vis-a-vis China, have largely been continued under Biden and actually accelerated and enhanced. And I think you'll see the same thing going forward, whether it's Donald Trump who gets back into the White House or Kamala Harris. The prospect of the U.S.-China relationship going back to where it was in the 2000s or early 2010s, I think is over.
All right. Xi Jinping calls it a traditional friendship. You call it a new Cold War. Where do you see it going in the coming years?
Well, of course, the key issue here is to keep the Cold War cold. We have to avoid a hot conflict at all costs. That would be disastrous, not just for the United States and China themselves, but obviously for the rest of the world. It would take the world into global depression, not to mention the loss of life that would be seen in a conflict like that. But beyond that, we need to make sure that, frankly, from the United States perspective and the perspective of a free democratic world, that the United States wins this competition, because what we don't want to see is China establishing a hegemony, first in East Asia and then globally.
Dmitri Alperovitch, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Lily MacElwee serves as Deputy Director at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She has a particular interest in US-China relations, which is why it is a great time to have her here on the programme with us. Welcome to DW. Now, considering the current state of affairs, tell us how significant it is that President Joe Biden's national security advisor has had this meeting with the Chinese president, with Xi Jinping.
Glad to be here. I think it's, as you mentioned, a highly uncertain and volatile time in the relationship. We have ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the Middle East. We have a new administration in Taiwan. We have Chinese aggression in the South China Sea against the Philippines. And we also have a very dynamic U.S. election cycle happening right now, with major changes over the past month in terms of Harris's replacement of Biden on the Democratic ticket. So I think, given the Biden administration's strategy of managing periods of tension and ensuring that competition does not lead into conflict, a visit really makes sense in that context. And I think China's watching very carefully the U.S. election and probably wants to know the future direction of U.S.-China policy at this stage.
You mentioned some of the issues that China and the U.S. seem so completely opposed on. So there are so many issues. So what is it that drives them to keep talking? And what do they have to lose if things go from bad to worse?
So I think both sides are dealing with major internal and external challenges. The international environment, as I mentioned, is increasingly volatile, increasingly complex, and both states will have to deal with that. I think what drives this particular engagement is, on the U.S. side, a desire and an acknowledgement that the Biden administration is not out of office yet. We still have several months. This is a really important and dangerous time, in a way, in the relationship. There's also a bit of legacy thinking going on. Biden has already made progress with China in gaining cooperation on counter-narcotics, military-to-military communication and cooperation. And looking ahead, I think there's a desire to solidify that progress and ensure that future administrations are greeted with some degree of progress and some degree of institutionalization and formalization of these types of dialogues.
As you say, we have a US election coming up in a couple of months' time. From the Chinese perspective, do you have a read on what a second dose of Donald Trump would mean for the future of this relationship?
I think the Chinese leaders, Beijing, are watching this election very carefully. I don't think they're jumping to conclusions. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what a second Trump administration would look like in terms of China policy. We know that higher level tariffs have been threatened, but we'll probably see a lot of consistency on the security issues and even economic issues between the two candidates, given there's a sense that whether it's the South China Sea or Taiwan, or even China's support for Russia against Ukraine, and tightening Russia, China, North Korea ties, the security picture for the United States looks scary. And both Harris and Trump will be greeted with that security picture. On the trade side, I think Harris has announced that she will also continue tariffs on China. So we're not actually going to see huge differences, I think, in the substance of China policy. We will see differences on the margins. And I think a Harris administration would be more interested in continuing the types of dialogues that we saw with Sullivan's visit to Beijing this week.
Lily MacElwee, Director at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. Lily, thanks so much for taking the time today. We appreciate it.